to John and to Dick and to the Eagleton Institute, and I was very inspired learning about Mayor Holland, both the practical life of politics and a real commitment to openness, which is really wonderful. So I'm delighted to be here. What is corruption? So I'm running for Congress right now. Just think, is it corrupt if somebody approaches me and says, I can raise $100,000 for you if you make closing the carried interest loophole a center of your campaign? What's your hunch? Is it corrupt if the Delaware County Democrats, a group that meets on Wednesday nights once a month, about 20 executive or 20 members of the Delaware County Democrats, comes together and says, we'll give you our endorsement if you focus a lot of this campaign on watershed issues? You can just see in those two examples how this is a bit of a puzzle, because we have one instinct in one area and one instinct on another. But I would argue that the puzzle of corruption and the idea of corruption is really central to American history, and certainly central to the crisis that we're facing right now. So I want to lay out to you, this is by no means exhaustive, 3 different ideas of corruption that you might find in political science or the way people talk about corruption. One idea is that corruption is that which is against the law or a norm. You know, that basically it's corrupt if it's violating an anti-corruption law. Like if you're, the way that those who would define it this way might say is effectively Justice Kennedy did in Citizens United, if it's not against a bribery law, then it's probably not corruption. I'll call that the positive idea of corruption. Basically, like we look at norms, positivist for those of you in philosophy, or perhaps you study this in political science, that if it's norm violating or law violating, it's corruption. But I don't have any independent view on whether it's corrupt or not. I would first have to see if there's a rule in the community. The second idea is basically, and I'd actually argue this is the dominant idea in a lot of political theory and economic theory, is that corruption is a very nice word. People have a very strong emotional reaction to it, but that it's not really a meaningful word. That it's a word that doesn't effectively make any sense. Corruption is basically just inequality. It's just a subset of inequality. That's what those on the left might say, or those who are closer to descendants of Thomas Hobbes might say corruption is an idea that doesn't make any sense, because if all people are selfish and egotistical, then the idea of being selfish and egotistical in public life is just what life is. Everybody's always corrupt all the time. So there's really an incoherent idea around corruption. Now, the idea about corruption, which I buy into, and we'll talk about a lot more, is the idea that corruption is when people in public power use that public power for private or selfish ends. None of these definitions, I would point out, have easy or clear contours, but I want to make an argument first from history about why this idea of corruption is at least the right one for America. And when I turn to history, I think of myself as a Langston Hughes patriot. I think it's important to use history in a way where you don't sentimentalize our past, but also draw from the wisdom of our past. So Langston Hughes has this wonderful poem about America. Does anybody know it? Remember, I'm a law professor, so I can call on you at any point. Let America be America again. Let it be the dream the dreamers dreamed. America was never America to me, he says. And the core sentiment that he expresses in this poem about America is, let America be the best version of itself. And I think it's a really important demand. It's certainly been an important one for me, because it says, yeah, we have a terrible history in a bunch of areas, but I'm not going to throw that out. And yes, we have a wonderful history in a bunch of areas, but I'm not going to try to return to that. 1950s America isn't where I want to be. 1830s America isn't where I want to be. So in my investigation of the history of what corruption means, what I'm trying to do in the Langston Hughes sort of vein say, is there some real wisdom in the way that we have historically understood corruption that we might bring to bear on what I think is a current crisis of money politics? So let's look, for instance, at the wisdom that you find at the Constitutional Convention. At the Constitutional Convention, it turns out they talked about corruption more than they talked about anything. They talked about it more than they talked about violence, or factions, or Shays' Rebellion, the local political event. It was woven into almost every day a discussion of how can we protect against corruption. As I think Madison said, if we don't protect against corruption, we will soon be at an end. I hate to ask the gentleman in the Nike shirt, but this is a video-free event. Thanks. I'm totally flattered, but thanks. So there's all these different ways in which they brought up and talked about corruption at the convention. They talked about it, for one of the things they called one of the central puzzles was what they called the problem of placemen. Not placemats, the problem of placemen. And so the problem of placemen is when people went into public office, and in order not just to serve their own constituents, but to serve some other power. So the problem at the time, again, just imagine the context of the time is we don't want to be England, basically. We see that as Patrick Henry, I think, said, the greatest fabric that history has ever reared was rent and torn apart by corruption. So we like a lot about what's happened in England, but we want to create something new, and we see the real problem with England is one of corruption. So how do we fight that? And so the problem of placement is basically you get a really good job at a post office if you were an elected representative. So go into office, get a good job at the post office, or get a good job as working for the king in one way or the other. And effectively, the reason you're a placeman is you'd be working for the king instead of your borough. Make sense? And they went back and forth and included in the Constitution what George Mason then called the cornerstone of the Constitution, which is the provision that forbids dual office holding. You can't hold an office and be an elected representative at the same time. And the reason I find this so poignant is because we have a modern problem of placement. It's not the king, but people go into public office and have a more than 50% likelihood, if they are going to Congress, of becoming lobbyists when they leave Congress. So it's really hard for any of us, if we're working at the post office, to not serve our boss while we're serving our borough, but it's also really hard for any of us to not serve our future employer. Those of you who are students probably know this feeling, like, I don't want to do anything that's going to hurt the chances of getting that future job. Well, if over 50% of people are going into lobbying afterwards, they're serving in some subconscious way, if not consciously, those future offices. So I think we have a modern problem with placement. But they talked about provisions that you might not expect, like the size of the veto they talked about in terms of how big the veto was, how likely would that be to lead to corruption. The size of the House of Representatives, the size of the Senate, the day of voting. This is an anti-corruption provision that hasn't necessarily worked out that well, or at least not in the way planned. But the idea that all electors would vote on the same day was seen as an anti-corruption provision, because it was, given the distances between towns, it would be too hard to coordinate a national bribery campaign for the presidency if all the electors were voting on the same day. There's a provision which has led to the title of my book, Benjamin Franklin's Snuff Box, that I really point out because I think it exemplifies in some ways how wonderfully radical our founders were about corruption. There was a convention all throughout Europe, except for the Netherlands. And the Netherlands, in fact, a modern scholar in the 16th century made fun of the Netherlands for having the exception here. The provision, or not the provision, the cultural, the habit, what was done throughout Europe is after the end of a diplomatic tour, the diplomat would get a very nice present from the king of the country in which they had been a diplomat. And we're talking, worth half a year's salary or more, right? And this was the convention, that was the word I was seeking for. The Netherlands, they had a rule that you weren't allowed to do this, and the 16th century commentator says, who does the Netherlands think they are, trying to build Plato's republic in the marshes and fens? Because it was like, come on, you have to give gifts. Gifts are part of international diplomatic relations. Well, Benjamin Franklin, upon returning to France, upon leaving France, gets a very nice diamond-encrusted snuff box from the King of France. And this is just what is done. But instead of the set of states accepting this as great, there was a big hubbub, there was discussion, he had to show it to Congress, and we have included in our Constitution a provision that forbids accepting a gift of any kind whatsoever from a foreign power without first getting permission from Congress. And the theory there was not that Benjamin Franklin was making a secret deal with the King of France regarding trade policy. It wasn't that there was an explicit bribe. It wasn't, here's my snuff box, give us that deal. It was the understanding that these kinds of gifts can corrupt us in soft ways, that it leads to an orientation of the spirit, where you're oriented towards those who pay your way and who give you gifts. And that we in this young country were determined to have a different kind of spirit than what we saw as the corrupt France and the corrupt England. The aftermath of this story is that our country's Thomas Jefferson, who I sometimes call our country's favorite hypocrite, Thomas Jefferson, who had been an advocate for the snuff box clause and for getting corruption out of government himself after this new constitution is passed, gets a diamond-encrusted portrait from the King of France after his tour. And so, of course, he takes it to Congress, right? No. He writes a letter to his aide saying, I don't want to be put in front of the gridiron of Congress. Has his aide take the diamonds out one by one, take them to a jeweler, sell them, and put the money into his own private account. So Jefferson, as always, breaks our heart. After the Constitution was passed, and during the debates, corruption came up again and again as well, this sense that we have built a document that can provide some barricades against the corruption that besieges all countries. Franklin thought our country could only last 200 years, given the threats of corruption. That would be amazing. Alexander Hamilton from New York said, we erected every practicable obstacle to cabal and corruption in writing the Constitution. In that time, when they were talking about corruption, they were not talking about criminal bribery laws. And the reason we know that they weren't is because there were no criminal bribery laws applied to elected representatives. There were bribery laws that applied to judges and to basically those taking taxes, people at the ports. There were bribery laws there, but there weren't bribery laws basically in any state, or certainly the federal government, saying it is illegal for a Congress member to take money in exchange for a vote. It just didn't exist. So when they were talking, even using the language of bribery, they weren't talking about bribery laws so much as this spirit. The corruption they were talking about was when those in public office used that public office for private selfish ends, to get money for themselves, to get power for themselves, not when they used that public office in service of the general public. And they're not naive. This isn't a story of the founding writers of the Constitution sort of having a pie-in-the-sky idea about human nature. I actually think of it more the way that we think of, say, a good parent. That we don't expect the good parent, when we say that we want the good parent to take care of their child, we don't expect that parent to have no selfish interests and not to pursue any interests, but we have a sense that there's a fiduciary relationship and a demand of love towards that child. And maybe you can't put a precise line on it, but you can tell the difference when culturally those in public office in general are serving with public love, and when there's another culture of corruption, when those in public office are doing it on the whole for some private selfish interest. So that's the way they were talking about it. So what happened in this young country to this idea of corruption? Well, of course, immediately it becomes incredibly difficult to make real in laws. There are a few really interesting, I'll talk about two really interesting incidents and stories that I think illustrate why corruption is actually really difficult when it runs into law, like definitions of what corruption means. One of the first ones involved the Yazoo lands. In western Georgia, there were millions of acres of land, and the Georgia legislature was offered a deal, a terrible deal. Pennies on the acre for all of this land. So at first they said no. Basically, there are a couple companies that came to them and said, we want to buy the land. First, the Georgia legislature says no, and then the companies go and give stock, interest, and cash to all but one of the Georgia lawmakers. And the Georgia legislature says yes, but the governor vetoes it. Then they give interest in the land sale to the governor. The land sale passes. The governor doesn't veto it. The land is out the door, right? The people of Georgia did what we all do when you have a corrupt legislature. They voted the entire legislature out, saying this was a travesty. And that wasn't enough. They did what we all do when we have a corrupt law passed. They had a bonfire and they burnt the law. Saying, we want to be absolutely clear that this was a law passed through bribery. That was our land. You can't sell it just because you were all bribed to sell it. Well, this becomes a really tough legal case, right? Because is a law not a law because all the lawmakers involved were bribed? Does it not stand? This is a really interesting question. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and this is a notorious Supreme Court case because it is the only Supreme Court case I know of in which one of the justices had to take time off to sober up in the middle of oral argument. Do you think we have Supreme Court scandals now? He was the lawyer for Georgia. Georgia did not win the case. Instead, what Chief Justice Marshall said is, it's sad that this corruption has crept into our young republic, but it's not for me to say which laws are passed corruptly and which ones aren't. What if less than half of the people who voted for it have been bribed? Would that be a corrupt law? How many people who voted for something have to be corrupt to make it a corrupt law? So you see, instantly it runs into this puzzle of like, how do we enact this anti-corruption principle in reality? Another sort of, it's not just an individual example, but another case or situation that helps raise the question of what corruption means and what it means in law is that involving lobbying. So basically, for really until the 1920s, lobbying was against the public policy of the United States and against the public policy of most states. It was a crime in Georgia. It was in the Constitution, criminalizing lobbying as a felony in the Georgia Constitution of 1877. It was a crime in California. But for the most part, it wasn't that prosecutors were going around prosecuting lobbying. It's that it came up in contract law cases. So let me explain. Say John and I have a contract where John is going to paint my house. Okay? He paints my house. I promise to pay him $100, and then I don't pay him $100. He's going to take me to court and sue me on the contract, right? Well, what happened for effectively 100 years is if instead of house painting, John promised to lobby for me. He says he's going to lobby on my behalf. I say I'm going to pay him $100. I don't pay him. We go to court, and the courts say, tough luck, John. Because lobbying is so fundamentally corrupt, we're not going to enforce that contract. So just to get a sense of parallel, there's a long history of not enforcing contracts for prostitution, not enforcing contracts to sell organs. These are contracts which were deemed as against public policy, so even if we made a private deal, the courts wouldn't recognize them. So the great case involving lobbying, fascinating case involving lobbying, is Trist versus Child, where an old man who's too weak himself to go to Washington, D.C. is actually legitimately owed thousands of dollars by the U.S. government from the Battle of Guadalupe. He can't get his money back. He hires a Boston lawyer to lobby for him. The Boston lawyer goes to Washington. He talks to people. He meets with them. He writes letters. He gets the thousands of dollars back. He gets it to the old man. The old man says, thank you. The lobbyist says, pay me. And the old man says, I'm not going to pay you. You're a corrupt lobbyist. So this also goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And you can see how this engages questions of corruption. In fact, the Supreme Court case was all about corruption. The question was, should we enforce this contract? The Supreme Court says, there's no evidence in this case of a deal, right? There's no evidence of the lobbyists bribing the Congress members, because that was one of the real concerns. But if we are to enforce this contract between the lobbyist and the old man, well then the great corporations of our day will all hire adventurers to plead their cases in the state houses and the federal government, and every right-thinking man would call that corrupt. So the court effectively says, this may not be corrupt itself, but it will lead to corruption, and so we can't allow this particular instance. And I raise it not because I think we should criminalize lobbying, but because it shows how much corruption was at the center of thinking throughout our history. I'm going to skip over another 100 years. Crudely, what you see is that, remember how I said that there were no criminal laws against bribery? You start seeing those in 1920, but they don't really start getting enforced until, with some exceptions, they don't really start getting enforced until Teddy Roosevelt and then really FDR. So there's these laws on the books criminalizing all kinds of bribery, but in a real politics way, they're not enforced. For a while, after in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s, basically, who's deciding what corrupt is and what corrupt isn't? It's the juries. Because you bring a general case to a jury, basically saying, find him guilty if you think this is a corrupt deal, but not without a lot of guidelines on what corruption meant. However, you still see this spirit, that spirit that I talked about at the founding, that corruption is when those in public office use that public office for selfish ends. That's the language you see in the cases. That's the sort of ethos and the idea that courts should be part of the protection against those in public office becoming venal and self-seeking. So then what happens? Benjamin Franklin's bet, remember him, 200 years? In 1976, the Supreme Court decides Buckley versus Vallejo. And it's a really important case because it's really the first case where this understanding, this ethos, this spirit of the meaning of corruption starts getting eroded. In Buckley versus Vallejo, you don't have to be law students for this, but roughly it's really the first time the Supreme Court strikes down anti-corruption laws. These were laws governing how much money could be spent in an election. And then from 1976 through 2010, you see justices fighting back and forth over the definition of corruption. And the reason it becomes really important in 1976, that this dinner table puzzle of what does corruption mean becomes really legally important, is because in 76, the Supreme Court says, you have a First Amendment interest to spend money in the service of your political views in a campaign. Okay? And that's the interest. Congress can override the money spending interests of corporations and parties if it has an anti-corruption interest. So suddenly we care a lot if there's an anti-corruption interest. Does that make sense? They're sort of weighing these two values together. And these are two very serious values, speech values and anti-corruption values. But once you say we're going to do a weighing, we care a lot about the weight of what this thing means, what this corruption thing means, okay? So justices fight back and forth. The cases flip back and forth about the definition of corruption. Sometimes it's described only as bribes. Sometimes it's described in terms of the sort of traditional understanding that I've given. And then in 2007, there's this case that pops up that piques my interest, which is when I started writing about this, in which Justice Roberts says, basically, this is his language, enough is enough. Corruption is quid pro quo and nothing more. That's what corruption means. Okay? So this, just to be clear, this sounds really smart, right? Quid pro quo. That sounds like that's got definition and heft and weight to it, right? I mean, it's Latin after Quid pro quo was not part of the definition of corruption really until the 70s. So he's using this Latinate phrase, and it sounds like it has clear contours, but as the Sixth Circuit once said, what was it? He was quoting from The Godfather. It was a great case. Not all quid pro quos are the same as the other, something like that. Not all quid pro quos are like a quid pro quo that doesn't have any clear meaning, but it sounds like he's got a solid meaning, but what we see is this radical narrowing of what corruption means. After 2007, 5 members of the Supreme Court said, corruption is quid pro quo bribery and nothing else. So I started writing about it. I apparently got picked up by some of the justices because I was cited in dissent in Citizens United by Justice Stevens, writing about this history. But the majority in Citizens United, and then McCutcheon versus FEC, the more recent case in this, just reiterated and hammered down on that core idea that corruption is quid pro quo. All these other things that we might call corrupt, 5 members of the Supreme Court have said are not corrupt. And what is the effect? Well, the effect is super PACs. The effect is candidates terrified to say things that might offend the most powerful interests in our country because they might have a flood of outside money, which the Supreme Court has said is not corrupt. The effect is a Congress which cannot act to pass a whole series of anti-corruption laws because 5 members of the Supreme Court have said those aren't anti-corruption laws because we have defined corruption as only quid pro quo corruption. And the effect as a candidate is that you spend way too much of your time raising money and way too little of your time doing the fundamental job that our founders dreamed of, which is serving the public, orienting your spirit towards the public interest. I haven't given this talk in a while, and I'm about to talk about what we can do, and I will tell you what we can do about corruption is so different than it was 5 months ago or 6 months ago. Because right now, remember I told you how 5 members of the Supreme Court said that corruption is quid pro quo and nothing else. Well, 4 members of the Supreme Court called on this deep American history and tradition of understanding that corruption is a core American value, that it was part of the Constitutional Convention, that it means something far broader than just explicit deals made by clumsy deal makers, right? And that means our next Supreme Court justice could join those 4, overturn Citizens United, overturn Buckley versus Vallejo, free Congress to actually respond to the public demand to pass anti-corruption laws. And so one of the most important things we can do is demand, and this is a demand whether you're a Republican or Democrat or unaffiliated or independent or anything, is demand that the next Supreme Court justice be committed to this deep American value that we are built around the fight against corruption. It's one of the best parts of who we are. And that summer in Philadelphia, they were money and politics focused. and that we demand that the next justice understand that and understand this as a core value, because it's not just about one case. It's not just about Citizens United. It's not just about Buckley versus Vallejo. It's about bringing a spirit to the court that we refuse to allow our democracy to be overrun by big money. So that's a demand that we all can make and can have a real substantial influence. And we could overturn Citizens United in the next year and a half. That's possible. The second thing we can do, and is happening in so many places and I think is so important, is we can pass public financing of elections. And we can do that right now with this Supreme Court. And the reason that's connected to corruption in such a core way is that private financing of elections, nobody would have ever built a private financing of election system. It's hard to imagine George Mason sitting in a sweaty room in Philadelphia saying, let's build a system that requires candidates to spend all their time not learning about the issues of their district, but begging at the feet of the wealthiest interests in the country, right? It's hard to imagine. So we sort of stumbled into this system that isn't working and that is deeply corrupting. Not every lawmaker is corrupt, but the system is corrupt. And lawmakers who go into the system can be corrupted because we're all affected by our jobs, right? If your job from 9 to, most Congress members spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money right now. Think about that. If 50%, let's just go in the middle there, if half of your day job is talking to people who have the capacity to give over $2,700, that's a pretty small category of people. And it takes that natural human impulse we have to care about somebody you were talking to and perverts it and says your day job is listening to people who are not representative of the people in your district. Of course that's corrupting of the system. I think people really feel that. Public financing of elections frees our politicians to serve the public. That doesn't mean they're all going to be perfect or virtuous, but with a public financing system, and there's different systems, but basically you need to make sure whether through a matching system or a block grant, individuals all have enough money if they show they have grassroots support to get heard. I mean, it's really about just enough to get heard so that voters can make a real choice. It frees you in the day to listen to people, to listen to stories instead of polls, to go deep into what's possible. And to actually orient your day job to what we want the job to be, which is focused on the public. What's happening now is that cities and cities across the country are passing public financing systems. So this isn't just a state issue or a federal issue. I think we should have public financing at every level. But when you see the League of Women Voters in your local city organizing to say this is something we can push for, it's fantastic. And by the way, it leads to a lot more women running for public office. It leads to a lot more people of color running. And it changes essentially, of course, allows a bus driver, a nurse to run for public office because you don't need, your qualification is no longer how much money can you raise, it's how many voices can you raise. How many people can you get out? So it really transforms, also brings a lot of young people into the process, which I think is essential. So that's something you can do at the state level, at the local level, at the national level. The other thing that we can do actually goes back to this, where I started, which is this ethos question. I think, and you certainly see this, this tension between people being fed up and hope, brokenness and excitement in our country right now, right? I think part of our hope, part of our reclaiming American democracy to be the America that it could be, requires understanding that this anti-corruption spirit is an American spirit, so that it's not just a post-Watergate thing, it's who we are at core, and that what we should demand as an ethical demand, as a high standard, is maybe you're a public servant, is gonna mess up on the math sometimes. Maybe your lawmaker is gonna make a bad decision. But what you wanna know is in the middle of the night, if she's asked up, she's woken up and there's a crisis, is she gonna be thinking of the public or is she gonna be thinking of her own interest? That is our core demand. And I think you see that demand rising. We have to have high expectations that understand people's humanity. Demand this kind of public love that our founders would have wanted. So if I can find it, I want to return to the poem I began with. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose, says Hughes. The steel of freedom does not stain. For those who live like leeches on the people's lives, we must take back our land again, America. Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we the people must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. Thank you.
We do have time for some Q&A. If you
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
When you're called upon, if you could just state your name and where you're from, that'd be great. Professor Teachout, would you like to call the first audience member? Does anybody have questions?
Are you a student?
Hi, my name's Matt Nino. I'm not a student, but I hope to be something. My question in your campaign that's coming up for
Yes.
the 19th district, I guess you have very practical decisions to make then in terms of your funding and how the money
Yes.
comes about. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that in the context of the current political craziness we're in, where the leading Republican guy doesn't spend, this Citizens United money, and the one who did spend all the money, Bush, didn't get anything out of it. And so, if you can give us a perspective of money in politics, knowing this experiment and how it's playing out,
Yes.
and how you will do it.
As I believe I said on, you're talking about how much money did Jeb Bush spend? 150 million? Yeah. So I was asked about this on Chris Hayes a while back, and because this is like, how is it? Isn't this proof that because Bush spent more money than anybody? Isn't this proof that money doesn't corrupt? And I'll tell you a glib answer and then a deeper one. So, but the glib one is actually sort of serious too. One of the reasons I care so much about decentralized power and not giving too much power to any individual, whether they be the head of a big company, or just too much concentrated power, or a governor, is because people in power have historically made terrible, terrible decisions. And one of my good friends always talks about the army that marched in the wrong direction for 2 weeks. There's a kind of a dream that perhaps those with a lot of wealth and power are actually a lot smarter than the rest of us, but they're not. That's sort of a fundamental belief I have. So that campaign is an example that you can't actually, money alone isn't going to make a great candidate, right? And so that doesn't change the core truth, which is that almost all the candidates, with exceptions, are spending far too much time thinking about their donors and therefore serving their donors even when they're on the campaign trail. It changes who is even on the table for running for president. Nobody is running for president in that set that you talked about on the Republican side who doesn't either have access to a lot of wealthy donors or a lot of wealth themselves. So it's cut out people whose voices actually really, really matter. The other sort of deeper answer is actually the presidency is different than a lot of our offices because you get a lot of press attention. And so for many, many races, most congressional races, it's very difficult to get a lot of local press attention for a whole bunch of reasons, so that having a message won't necessarily lead to people knowing that you exist. Does that make sense? And so when you look at the whole system, exceptions don't disprove the systematic rule about corruption. What I will say is that people clearly feel shut out. They clearly feel like the system is broken, and they're right about being shut out, and they're right about the system being broken, and that doesn't mean they're right about who they're picking as their candidate. But that sentiment, I mean, I hear it from Trump supporters that I've met, is that talking about, I just don't want to have candidates working for their donors. The Trump model is billionaires get to run. That's not a democratic model, right? That isn't actually a functional model. The press story on the Trump side is a very complex story about why there's been so much attention. But I would say that it doesn't disprove the general rule. And what we want is not just looking at particular moments. We want to build a system that doesn't tend to lead to corruption. And this again is the founder's ethos. It's not that you don't look at the particular instance, is the system one that leads to corruption?
In your campaign?
Oh, in my campaign, right. So, two things. One is that I am, I of course want to, a few grassroots campaigns don't prove that we don't need to change the system, we need to change the system. Having said that, I'm fortunate that we've had already over 4,300 individual donors with an average of $30 apiece. And I'm going to continue to work to make grassroots low-dollar donors the center of my campaigns so that I can be free to listen to the voters in my district and be, work on constituent service instead of work on the service of donors. I'm doing traditional fundraising as well, but I'm doing everything I can to build that base. And that's important not just for running for office, but continuing to represent in Congress. So, that I don't want to be at the 50% level for fundraising in office.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
My name is Jeffrey Davis. I'm not a student. Oh, sure. My name is Jeffrey Davis, not a student. I'm just an armchair public policy performer, whatever that may mean. Propose some legislation. Do you tell me if you think it's something that could pass or it's off target? Something I call the open lobbying law, that Congress people cannot just have private meetings with donors or other lobbying organizations. It has to be open so that the press could get in and then report on it, and that way regular people can listen and find what's going on.
So I'll play devil's advocate for a second and then tell you about my own history here, because I like the sentiment, but I will tell you that when maybe it's most helpful to talk about my own history on this kind of issue. I was the national director of the Sunlight Foundation. We focused on transparency in Congress, and I led a campaign we called the Punch Clock campaign. And the Punch Clock campaign was a campaign to get members of Congress and senators to share their private schedule to punch the clock because they work for us, right? And so it's not really devil's advocate, but I'll tell you what we ran into. It was fascinating to run this campaign. Then Congresswoman Gillibrand was one of few who signed on. Not very many people signed on at the time, but we at least raised this issue of spending time. This was in 2006, 2007. What we heard and then modified our Punch Clock campaign was, okay, well, there are people who are going to want to come with private stories that are really meaningful to them, that might be embarrassing if it's out there in the public. And we have to have some room for at least some privacy for some of these interactions. And we actually then included, I think, this has been over 10 years, but 10% of your time doesn't have to be on the punch clock, so you can have these private meetings. But I think, from the constitutional issues around it, I don't know that I want all public officials to not be able to think out loud from time to time and try out ideas, and have a like push back and forth conversation with you know, the group I just like, a local club that cares a lot about fracking. You know, say, hey, I don't know much about it, but let's talk back and forth. That the vulnerability that comes with not knowing, I think, is a real value. So that's where my hesitation comes. What I want is, I mean, the reason I care so much about public financing, besides all the other reasons I've talked about, is that it gives lobbyists power for reasons that have nothing to do with the value of their information and the people they represent. Does that make sense? So right now, if you're a lobbyist, sorry, well, I know you don't want to, probably don't want to be one, for a local factory, and you call up your senator, because it's important to the people who work there that something gets, you know, again, something happens with a watershed or you figure something out. I think that's okay if the senator answers because she wants to learn about what's happening, okay? Like, this is actually quite relevant. What doesn't make sense is if the senator takes the call because, and you're probably not a local company if this is the case, because the lobbyist who makes the call, the senator knows is attached to $30,000 worth of campaign funding. Does that make sense? You never have to have an explicit deal. So this is the dance. This is the gift dance, our modern snuff box dance. Is the lobbyist calls up and says, I just want to talk about the issues. The staff takes the meeting in part because they know there's campaign cash that will flow if they take the meeting. It's really buying access, right? And so I think there's room for the kind of petitioning that can happen. What I don't think there's room for is when that petitioning is tied to implicit cash. I once testified in front of a congressional committee on this, and the sort of spirit of it was X-ray doesn't heal the patient. So we need transparency in some areas, but I actually think what we need more fundamentally is structural reform in the way the system works to take away the power and the reason there's so many lobbying meetings. But I'm interested in the idea, and I'm interested in anything that involves the word open. so thank you. I see student.
Hi, my name's Joe. I'm a student here at Rutgers. This is kind of off topic, but with the president's announcement, closing Guantanamo Bay, like what's your position on closing it or what to do with the detainees?
I am going to stay on topic tonight because I feel like we could very easily turn into a all public policy array. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Gregory. So I have a cold, so I may not.
I'm sorry, I have a cold too.
Do it clearly. So I recently did a project and presentation on the concept of corporate personhood, which I believe is slightly related to Citizens United and other areas of our government, and the relationship between big businesses and who they choose to affiliate themselves with.
Yeah.
Could you comment on your attitudes towards, so corporate personhood and the concept of an artificial person is useful and pragmatic in many ways, but could you comment on how you think that affects our democracy and how you feel about the ethics of that whole concept?
Yeah, well, you obviously have looked really deeply into this because you've already talked about some sort of complicated issues around it. As you alluded to, for purposes of a lawsuit, you're going to treat a corporation not as a person, but technically as a person for purposes of fulfilling the certain legal requirements for the suit to take place. I think what's disturbing And a lot of people responded to Citizens United by talking about it as a corporate personhood case. I guess you can see from my book and my writing is that I see it, well, there's a way in which I see it as similar, but I'm more focused on this kind of draining of the idea of corruption and the sort of core anti-corruption impulse that I see in Citizens United. It's a very thin view and really decisive. There is something that I've written about and talked about elsewhere that isn't necessarily corporate personhood per se, but a deep ideology of 5 members of the Citizens United Supreme Court, which is this kind of skepticism of government as a way, at the legitimacy of government in some ways, and a kind of deep neoliberal preference for solving real public puzzles by deferring to large corporate actors. And you can see that kind of, not just the personhood question, but that kind of rhetoric, not just in the Citizens United decision, but other decisions. So I have been less focused on the personhood as the fatal flaw, and more focused on the economic and democratic theory of the court, with the belief that if they have a deep understanding of the principles of the anti-corruption principles and the importance of protecting against certain big companies gaining too much power, then those principles will reflect themselves in the decision. But certainly, not just in Citizens United, but in Hobby Lobby, you see a kind of a strain that is a little strange, where the language feels like it jumps around a little bit, and Stephen's dissent in Citizens United, I'm sorry, and I know I don't think you're a law student, but you were talking like one, so.
I'm a philosophy major, so I might as well be.
Okay. Okay, but you see, I think you see where I'm going with it, with this, and I've written a little bit about it. I can share an essay on it. Thanks.
How you doing, ma'am? I follow you on Twitter.
Uh-oh.
Great stuff up there. Good luck in your campaign.
On Twitter or here?
On Twitter, you have 35,000 followers ever since.
You and John both like elevating my numbers. It's great. I think I got close to 32%, and I think I have close to 32,000 followers. So just keep going up to 35.
Hopefully it'll translate to votes. I hate to put you on the spot here, but AIPAC's unfathomable control of Congress, is that a present day version of corruption, since a lot of congressional members do get 2-week junkets to Israel?
Yes, thank you for your question. You know, I want to talk more about the system as opposed to the individual actors within the system, because different people are going to call out different individual actors, you know? And I think the key here is we've built a system that leads to money having more power than the local voters. So to me, that's the key. Like, we can keep, you're gonna have one enemy, and you're gonna have a different enemy. And to me, the key is, like, let's really focus on rebuilding the car, because the car has been built in a way that doesn't make sense.
So on that note, is the system broken because that type of behavior is allowed by lobbyists?
Well, I think the system is broken. And I think most people think the system is broken. Yes.
A couple of years ago, there was a book whose title I have forgotten by Sarah Shays.
Yes, I've read. She's reached out. Yes.
Corruption.
Yeah, it's called.
Something in Afghanistan.
No, I forget the name of it.
It was about Afghanistan, and well,
Yes.
it was global.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
the argument was exactly what you were saying, that,
Yes.
that the American government was
Yeah.
trying to reform governments in various countries they were involved with. And this was a mistake,
Yeah.
because corruption was so pervasive and people's mistrust of government so total
Yeah.
that no reform of government was going to get anywhere.
Yeah.
And they had to, and the American authorities, she said, should get rid of corruption before they tackled any of the political problems or even economic problems.
Yeah, no, I think of it as sort of the, you know, Larry Lessig talks about this too, as the or the issue one. You know, that in so many different issues, it's a root issue. So I have not read the book, but you're not the first to say that there's a lot of overlap in discussing it. And I think what's, which I've written about a little bit, what's important is that when we share ideas about what America is about and what kind of systems work, we should be really focused on campaign funding systems as well. You know, that other countries look at this and see, you know, that doesn't look like, looks like we have a serious problem of corruption, corruption right there.
Well,
So one thing though that, you know, I tend to, one thing that I tend to think is that sometimes people say, you can't talk about corruption, you gotta talk about good government, because if you talk about corruption, it's gonna make people even more cynical and they're gonna drop out even more. And this is actually where I'm really interested in where Dick's book goes, because, yes, you. Because as we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of powerful history in America of corruption being a kind of activating force. Because it's telling a truth that people feel. And that if you soft pedal it, it just doesn't sound like that's people's reality. The trick is to use corruption as and the word corrupt, the reason I so disagree with the positivist understanding of corruption that I talked about at the very beginning, which is that which is corrupt is that which is against the law, is because then those in power get to define what corrupt is and what not corrupt is. And corrupt is I believe, a word that the powerless can use to accuse the powerful. And that it's important to use that as a political force, but not in a way that disempowers. That's always really, really tricky. I always tend to think there's such power in truth-telling, you know? So that alone is important. On the international scale, you know, I was talking, I was at a Brookings event recently, and I wish I could find the person who said this. I think it was a Brookings event on broken systems. And he was saying, you know, one of the real problems we have in terms of foreign policy is that Congress members who should be spending their time learning and should be elevated to the head of committees because they are the experts on China are elevated to committees because they are the best fundraiser. So that we're actually, you know, this is a little bit of a tangent, but our foreign policy is then affected by our campaign finance system. I saw a young man over here. Yes. And then I've got to get back to Dover in about. So this might be the last question. Is that okay?
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Brandon. I'm a third-year student here, and I really like how you were talking